Hello and welcome once again to How to Study Your Bible. This is week 4, Making and Applying Observations. I'm very excited to share the information this week with you because I think it will be very helpful and informative. In last weeks that we met, we studied a couple of different things. We have been looking at a high level on a 5-step word study process. Step 1 is where we select a word. Step 2 is where we look at how the word is used in an English modern context. And we do that just with the use of an English dictionary. Step 3 is where we go into the first step of looking at the Hebrew or Greek using a Hebrew or Greek dictionary to get ourselves acquainted with how the word we're interested in might be used in the biblical context. In this week, we are going to learn how to make observations about how a word is used in the biblical context, and we're also going to learn a little bit of how to apply those observations to ourselves once we've made those observations. We're basically going to get right to it, but there's a little bit more that we can talk about with regard to review. We learned how to use dictionaries in week 2, also in concordances we learned in week 2, and then commentaries we talked about in week 3. We have online tools as well. The Blue Letter Bible is one tool that's very accessible, and then Logos Bible software is also another tool that has a bunch of features, and one could spend a lot of time diving into this tool and find a lot of useful things in it. Here's the overview slide of how we can make and apply observations of a word in context. We can first make observations about the word in its context or contexts regarding 4 different factors. The first factor is the circumstances surrounding the word or the passage. The second is the characters in the passage. The third is the actions taken in the passage. And then the fourth category is the outcomes achieved in the passage. This might seem very abstract right now, but when we get into some examples in just a moment, I think you'll see a little bit of what this means. After we've done the making of observations in step 4, we can apply the observations we made. And the purpose of applying our observations is to enhance our awareness of truth about God, ourselves, and others. And we also can enhance our response to truth about God, ourselves, and others. Application is all about making head knowledge useful to our everyday lives that we live as Christians every day. Let's take a look at this first example. We're going to make some observations on a word in a passage. In this first example, we're looking at the word world in Mark chapter 16, verse 15. I'll be using the English Standard Version. So this word, world, is the Greek word cosmos, and that's got the Greek Strong's number, G2889. In step 4, we can make observations about the passage's circumstances, characters, actions, and outcomes. As I read through this passage, be thinking of where you can find circumstances, characters, actions, and outcomes in this passage, and also where you might want to look elsewhere in the Bible in order to find this information. Mark chapter 16, starting with verse 12. After these things he appeared in another form to 2 of them, as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Afterward he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, quote, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents with their hands, and if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." This is a pretty full passage. It's 6 or 7 verses, and there's a lot of information in it. What I want to do is try and help you, as an example, pull out some of the information that is key to our understanding the word world better. So I'm going to go and look at some of these observations that were made earlier. In this example, I've made a few observations which might help us to understand the word world in each of these categories: circumstances, characters, actions, and outcomes. These are not the only observations that you could make. There are many other observations that could be made, just to be clear, but here are some examples. First, for circumstances. If we look in verses 11 through 14, we can see in this passage that Jesus just rebuked disciples for not believing the good news when it was told to them. This good news, I guess we have to define for ourselves. Let's remind ourselves that Jesus just rose from the dead earlier in this chapter, and he has been appearing to small groups of people, to his disciples. And the disciples are shocked. They're shocked first at the report that some other disciples give, who say that Jesus has been risen from the dead, but they don't believe that message. They don't believe this good news. In terms of characters, this is often the easiest category to look at because we can look for the nouns in the passage. We definitely have Jesus, we have some of his disciples, and we have this other thing. He mentions the whole creation, and that the good news should be preached to the whole creation. That's a bit of a strange idea, so I've included the whole creation here as a character, even though you and I in our modern senses might not think of the whole creation as a character in a story. Moving on to actions, I can basically summarize some of the actions that I see here. A command to preach the good news exhaustively. Notice the uses of all and every in this passage. Notice we, as Christians who are sharing the good news, are not called to convert by force. We are preaching, and then the person who's hearing has the choice to believe or not believe. Outcomes. Preaching presses humans toward the decision that I just mentioned: belief or rejection. We see that in verse 16. Believers will follow Christ's example in his power, which has command of the natural order of the world. We see that evidence in verses 17 and 18. All of the extraordinary things which Jesus did in his ministry of healing and casting out demons are a signature of not just him, but of those who come in his name and share the good news of Jesus. That power radically intersects with the natural order of things. Let's go on to step 5, because we've made some observations, but right now they're just observations about this passage. We can take them one step further and apply them to ourselves and our own situation. This is a step that is usually very personal for a person, and it gets a little bit more towards the devotional side of Bible study. But here are some examples of how I might synthesize my observations into an application. So for this passage and for this verse, Mark 16:15, I might summarize an awareness of truth that I've gathered from my observations. What do I know now from my observations? This is my awareness of truth. I might say God wants the cosmos, this Greek word that we've been studying, world, which appeared earlier as the phrase the whole creation, actually. God wants the cosmos, and that appears to me to mean everyone, and perhaps even everything, to hear and be radically affected by the good news. The free will decision to believe the good news is up to the human hearer, not up to me and my own persuasiveness. My own response to this truth is something that I might phrase often for myself in the form of a prayer. I might say something like, God, please give me the grace to know how to be a winsome witness in every situation in which I find myself in this world and this existence. To everyone, and even everything that is made, to all creation. And as I do this, let me actively rely not on my power, but yours. some extra things that you can look at. There's a parallel passage to Mark 16:15, and that's found in Matthew 28:19. This is often referred to as the Great Commission. And you'll see if you go to that passage that the wording is slightly different from how it's used in Mark. That would be interesting to study and compare. How would observations and application for this other passage in Matthew compare and contrast with those of Mark 16:15? I'll leave that exercise up to you. Let's go on to the second example. In this second example, let's look at a word in the Old Testament. So we're going to look at the word world again, but this time we'll be looking in Isaiah 13 verse 11. Again, in the English Standard Version. World renders the Hebrew word tevel, which has the Strong's number code H8398. If we're going to look at creating some observations, we have this section of verses. And I've tried to include some verses which have useful information in them for us. So let's read this out and be thinking of where you see circumstances, characters, actions, and outcomes. Verse 1. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. And then skip to verse 9. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Verse 11. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant, and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. Verse 12. I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. Skip to verse 17. Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver and do not delight in gold. Let's look at some example observations that one could make for each of these four categories. In the category of circumstances, we can see that this chapter starts with a message in verse 1. Isaiah has a vision. And in verse 19 actually, we can see that it's a vision about Babylon's doom. In terms of characters, we can see that clearly God is a character in this. Babylon is a character. The Medes are a character. And there are other characters that we could mention as well. For instance, sinners in verse 11, I believe. Yes, there are other characters. We could define other characters based on the qualities that are described about them. For instance, in verse 9, we could pick up a character of sinners. In verse 11, we could look at defining the wicked as a character, the arrogant as a character, the ruthless as a character. These are sort of abstract characters, but they help describe aspects of who this passage is pointed towards. Back to our observations. In terms of actions, we could say that God uses the Medes to destroy sinners from the land. These sinners perhaps being Babylon. And the outcome is something that we don't actually see in this passage. We see it best in the next chapter's first verse. The land is cleansed from sin, and God brings Israel back in. These are great observations, but what do we do with these observations? Well, let's go back to our applications and see what we can do in step 5. Just as a reminder, we synthesize or try to synthesize some truth that we weren't perhaps previously aware of, and then we try to formulate a response to this truth. So how does this passage in Isaiah 13 apply to us? Well, here are some example applications. God will cleanse the land of sin and plant his followers in it. While the immediate context is the land of Israel in this passage, the text hints toward his plans to do this for the entire Tevel, or the entire world, using whatever means he pleases in the process. Recall, in this passage, he uses a Gentile nation, the Medes, in order to judge the kingdom of Babylon. A response to this truth could be formulated as the following: God, you will judge the Tevel, the world, when and how you please. Instead of the pride and wickedness that are so commonplace in humanity, please let my life display a humility and submission toward you that is truly not of this world. As an exercise, you can do steps 4 and 5, making and applying observations for the word world in Isaiah 14, verses 17 through 21. Now, the question I have to pose to you is, how do your observations and applications change when you're doing this exercise in this other chapter, in this other passage? It's just one chapter over from the passage that we just did, but you might find that the word world conveys a slightly different idea here. Let's move on to a second category of examples. We call these observations on a word in a book. So let's first look in the book of Matthew at the Greek word proskuneo. This is the Strong's number G4352, and it's often rendered worship. If we start with step 4, we can look at circumstances, characters, actions, and outcomes. This time we have a list of verses that we look through, not only one. To find your list of verses, you can go to a place like Blue Letter Bible and go to the concordance section that's associated with a particular Greek or Hebrew word. I've linked the relevant concordance page list to this word here on the page. So, for here, we have our Greek word proskuneo, and if we scroll down to the bottom of the page, we can find the list of verses that contain this Greek word. We have a lot of verses, but I've picked out 3 verses that I think will be relevant and helpful for us, and we will find these here. In Matthew 4:10 we read, "Then Jesus said to him, Begone, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." In Matthew 15:25 we read, "But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me." Matthew 18, verse 26 says, "So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." One of the interesting things we see about these verses is that the word worship in English does not appear in 2 of them. Nevertheless, if you look up these verses in an interlinear on a place like Blue Letter Bible, you will see that indeed the Greek word proskuneo is used in each of them. The only difference is that the English translators have seen fit, for some reason, to translate the Greek word into a different but related word that somehow captures a different facet of the word proskuneo. We can use this to our advantage in our word study. Let's look at some observations we could make. First, regarding circumstances, we can see that in chapter 4, verse 10, Jesus is responding to temptation by the devil while he is in the wilderness. In chapter 15, verses 25, a woman is begging Jesus for spiritual deliverance on behalf of her daughter. In chapter 18, verse 26, there is a story being told about a petitioning of a debt collector. The characters involved in each of these passages are various. We can list Jesus, the devil, and God in chapter 4, verse 10. We can list a Canaanite woman and her daughter and Jesus in chapter 15. And in chapter 18, there is a debtor and a dettee in a parable. Actions for each of these could be summarized as follows. In chapter 4, Jesus confirms that one should proskuneo God alone. In chapter 15, the Canaanite woman proskuneos Jesus, asking for help. In chapter 18, the debtor proskuneos the dettee, asking for more time to pay the debt back. Outcomes associated with these are in chapter 4, Jesus begins his ministry immediately after this run-in with the devil in the wilderness. In chapter 15, the daughter is healed. And in chapter 18, the dettee forgives the debt. These are interesting observations. Personally, I would want to investigate a whole lot more, but if we take our observations just as they exist right now, and we try to apply them, here's how we might look at that. We could look at an awareness of truth and try and synthesize our observations together, and we might say something like, proskuneo can acknowledge loyalty to a deity as well as communicate a heartfelt petition for help or favor from physical people. A response to this truth might be something like this: Lord, let my worship be characterized by loyalty to and dependence on you, not merely by moving musical experiences on Sundays. Worship is usually associated in the modern mind with singing songs and being in a room with other people and having a worship band and words on a screen and so many of these things which a Sunday goer who's gotten used to this culture will come to associate with the word worship. But as you see, in the biblical context, it is very difficult to directly find any of those things in these three passages that we looked at. There's much more of a focus and an emphasis on loyalty and submission and petition. And we can apply that in much the same way as you might hear in the book of Romans, chapter 12, where it says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, and this is your spiritual worship. Let's move on to the next example. In this second example, we're looking in the Old Testament at a Hebrew word, shachah, I think that's how it's pronounced, H7812, and we're going to be looking in the book of Genesis. As with this last New Testament word, this Old Testament word is rendered worship, but not always. We'll see some of the examples. In Genesis chapter 22, verse 5, we read that Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. In Genesis 23, verse 12, then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. In Genesis chapter 47, verse 31, we read, and he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. Take a moment and think of what circumstances, characters, and actions and outcomes jump out to you in each of these passages. Okay, let's look at some example observations. And just to beat this point home one more time, these are example observations. These are meant to be examples for you to look at and learn from. So, regarding circumstances, in chapter 22, verse 5, the context of this is a ritual sacrifice. In chapter 23, verse 12, Abraham is negotiating for a burial plot with a group of people who own the plot of land he would like to use. And in chapter 47, one character is communicating to his other the last wishes to his family and for his family. The characters in each of these passages are, in chapter 22, Abraham, Isaac, and God. It might come into remembrance now that this passage is where Abraham goes and, under God's direct order, goes to offer up his son Isaac as a burnt offering. In chapter 23, Abraham is with Ephron and the Hittites. Those are all characters mentioned in this passage. And in chapter 47, Jacob, or Israel, as he's called in the passage, is speaking with Joseph, one of his sons. The actions, in chapter 22, verse 5, Abraham and Isaac go to shachah, God. In chapter 23, Abraham shachad the Hittites. And in chapter 47, Israel shachad himself upon the head of his bed. In this passage, it is a bit unclear to whom Israel does this. Maybe he shachas to God. Perhaps he shachas to Joseph. So this is a point at which I myself throw up my hands and I say, I'm not quite sure. It produces a question for me. In outcomes, we can say, in chapter 22, God saves Isaac. He provides a ram for the sacrifice instead of Isaac having to be sacrificed. In chapter 23, verse 12, Abraham repeats a petition to Ephron and ends up getting the burial site. In chapter 47, the discussion is finished, and Israel seems relieved to have Joseph's promise. Okay, let's go on and look at some applications. Just as we've done in the previous 3 examples, we are interested in synthesizing an awareness of truth and a response to truth. So with the observations that we've made, how can we create a synthesized awareness of truth and a response to truth? Let's take a look at some examples. I've made these applications rather short, but as far as how these observations further our awareness of truth, we could say something like this. Shachah, or this Hebrew word worship, involves expression of honor, reverence, and respect for God as well as for people. A response to truth might look something like this in the form of a prayer. Lord, may I relate to you with the respect and honor that you are due, recognizing that you truly are worthy of it. Once more, we see just the same as we did in the New Testament. In this Old Testament passage, there is a strong emphasis on respect and honor, not so much on our modern sensibilities surrounding worship. This is an important thing to realize, and as we've said in previous weeks, the important thing about any word study is not necessarily to discover something new, but to discover something true. Well, thank you for going through these examples with me. I hope that they have been enlightening, and I hope that they strengthen your ability to study the Bible. If you'll join me for next week as we go into week 5, we'll be looking at some common misconceptions and common mistakes when doing word studies. Thanks, and I hope to see you there.